anxiety makes us feel closed and contracted. The more we let go or not get caught up in anxiety, the more expanded we feel. And the more we move into places like our growth zone, or the more we move into flow.
How do we break our addiction to negative thoughts?
The first thing I would say is what not to do, which is to try to kind of force ourselves not to have them. I don't know how many people come to me and say, how can I just clear my mind or stop having these thoughts? And I would say, that's an age-old issue and an age-old trap where people get stuck in thinking if they could just stop their thoughts, or if they were stronger, if they could use their willpower, all that. As much as we like to believe that willpower is a real thing and that we just don't have enough of it, if you look from a neuroscience perspective, that's not actually what drives the brain. So that's the first thing I would say is don't rely on your willpower. It's not it's not a fault that somebody has if they can't, stop that negative thinking pattern.
Super interesting. It's also a finite resource, as you kind of alluded to, right? I mean, we only have so much of it.
Yeah, at best. Yes.
At best. Unpack that a little bit. So is it, when you say that we shouldn't rely on our willpower, what then is at the root cause of negative thought loops, excessive rumination, worry, etc.?
Well, at the heart of that is ourself. And if you look at it, there's this great saying, this quote from Alan Watts, this philosopher who died in the 70s, I think. He said, our ego, the self which he believes himself to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. If you let that sink in, that, and even if you go back to ancient Buddhist psychology, they talk about, there are these phrases like, what we think and ponder upon thus becomes the inclination of the mind.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you look at all of those things, when we have certain thought patterns, if they are rewarding or reassuring or just comforting to some degree, and they could be comforting just because they're familiar, then we actually form the habits of having those thought patterns come up over and over and over. And then we believe that's who we are. I'm an anxious person. I'm a depressed person. I'm a this or that. But in fact, I'm a person who has anxious thoughts, has, depressive thoughts, or has negative thoughts or whatever. Those are completely different things. If we can see that we are a person that has thoughts versus being identified with them. And there's plenty of research showing that the more, these thought patterns become a habit, the more familiar they are and the more comfortable they are. And one thing we also know from research is that comfort, it's like the comfort zone is a real thing, so when we do something repetitively enough, it becomes comfortable just because it's familiar. And that's all from our brain survival mechanism, which is always looking out for, change. If something's unexpected, then we have to check to see if it's dangerous from a survival perspective. And so, there was even a paper published in 2014, I believe, around depression, where people with depression are more likely to pick sad music, sad pictures, sad thoughts, and not even, pick strategies that keep them feeling those states as compared to feeling better. I think their buzz phrase was, we go to what we know, whereas, it seems like, well, who would want to stay feeling sad? Well, that the comfort, the familiarity of a negative thought spiral may be rewarding enough to keep someone there. And then, because it's a negative thought spiral, it can be so, it just can deflate us and make us, kind of sink enough that it feels like it takes too much energy to get out of it.
Wow. So we, in essence, become what we repeatedly think.
Yes.
But to some degree, I feel like our thoughts, there's this sense, right or wrong, I'm sure you can offer clarity, but that our thoughts are autonomic, that they emerge, and that there's no, that it's just, they're innate to who we are, right? Like, I think a certain way because I am a certain way.
Well, I think that's something that we can all explore. So certainly thoughts do come up spontaneously. It's not like we have to, every time we want to have a thought, we have to think, okay, now it's time to have a thought, so it's kind of like, the things coming in through our other sense doors. We see things, we hear things. those come up in our external environment and we interpret them, you can think of thoughts as coming up as like a sixth sense, in the sense that they come up and are interpreted by our mind as some type of an input. So they do come up by themselves, but certain thought patterns, it's not that we are constantly having random thoughts that get reinforced, that get reified. Those are the ones that we're more likely to have, and those are the ones that are more likely to become our habits. So just because we have spontaneous thoughts doesn't mean that we're going to identify with all of them. But as we get hooked on certain ones, then those get preferenced and those brain patterns get grooved more deeply.
Wow. So that could negative thoughts essentially be, or I guess we should say excessive negative thoughts, be distilled down to something as basic as a bad habit?
Some could argue yes.
Wow. How are habits formed?
So from a basic standpoint, this goes back to the survival mechanisms of our brain, which have, two main flavors. Many people have probably heard of positive and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement goes back to our ancient ancestors when we had to remember where food was. We had to find food and remember where it was so we could go get it again. So positive reinforcement has three main elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result or a reward from a brain standpoint. So basically, if you see some food, you're out foraging for food, right, in the woods or the savannah or whatever. You find the food, there's the trigger, you see it. Then you eat the food, there's the behavior. And then your stomach sends a dopamine signal to your brain that says, hey, remember what you ate and where you found it. So we lay down this context-dependent memory. So that's positive reinforcement in a nutshell, is, something that is, pleasant. And then we learn to repeat it. But basically it's there as a survival mechanism to remember to go do that again. If you look at negative reinforcement, it's the same thing. But you see whatever the danger is, the lion or the tiger or whatever chasing you, you run away. There's the behavior. And then the reward is that you survive. And then you learn to avoid that part of the jungle or the savannah or whatever, because you learn, oh, that's dangerous. So we learn to repeat things that are pleasant. We learn to avoid things that are unpleasant is the simplest way of putting it. So we can, our thought patterns can be reinforced in the same way. So, so for example, with anxiety, I never learned in medical school or residency that anxiety could be driven like a negatively reinforced habit. I just never learned that. That wasn't taught. That's not generally in the psychopharmacology textbooks, because they're like, here, use this medication. So when I was starting my clinical, my first clinic after residency, I was struggling helping my patients with anxiety. With medications, there's this term, number needed to treat, where it's like how many patients you need to give a medication to before, or any treatment to, before one person shows a benefit. So you kind of get a sense of magnitude. With medications, it's 5.2. So 1 in 5 patients shows a significant reduction in symptoms. So it's not great.
So you had to give medication to 5 people so that one would see a benefit.
Yep. So I was basically playing the medication lottery and getting anxious myself, because uncertainty causes anxiety. Or it can, because you don't know what's going to happen. You're like, oh, is this patient going to get help? So I started looking to see what I was missing. And we'd been developing an app for overeating called Eat Right Now. And I'd been testing that, and we'd actually gotten a 40% reduction in craving related eating. So we're like, oh, this works pretty well. Wow. And somebody in that program said, hey, could you develop a program for anxiety? Because anxiety is triggering me to stress eat. And I was thinking, well, I generally prescribe medications, but it put a bug in my ear to go look at this. And I went back and looked at the literature. Lo and behold, 1980s, so long, long time ago, Thomas Borkovec and others had suggested that anxiety could be negatively reinforced. And the way that works is the feeling of anxiety is the trigger. The mental behavior of worrying is the behavior. And typically we think of behaviors as like eating or smoking or whatever. But in fact, if you look at it, we can do things in our minds that are behaviors. So that worrying is a behavior. And that tends to make people feel in control, or at least distract them from the feelings of anxiety. And that is more rewarding than wallowing in the anxiety.
Hmm.
So that feeds back. So the next time somebody feels anxiety, they start worrying again. So in fact, anxiety can be driven like any other habit. So to test this, we actually developed an app called Unrunning Anxiety, tested to see if it worked. Ready for this? We got a 67% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores. And that number needed to treat, remember, lower number is better, 1.6.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. So that suggests that this negative reinforcement is true. And if you target the mechanism specifically, and we showed all this mechanistically, if you target that mechanism, lo and behold, it works pretty well. And that's very different than trying to tell people to stop worrying or, giving them a medication or something like that.
So is worry bad? I mean, is it bad when we worry?
There's so many judgments in the world, good, bad. Let's from a psychiatric standpoint, as a psychiatrist, I like to think of, is something helpful for us or is it not helpful for us? So do you mind if we use those terms?
I like those terms. Yeah.
Okay. It's getting at the essence of what you're asking, but it's, we're so good at judging ourselves as good or bad. I'm trying to, stay in the realm of healthy, what's healthy.
Yeah. I prefer that actually.
Yeah. And so we can think of it as like, what habit do I have that's helpful for me? And what habit do I have that's not helpful? And what I can say is that there's no evidence scientifically showing that worrying actually helps with anything. So thinking and planning is helpful. So, thinking about the future and planning for the future, obviously very helpful. But worrying is what tends to make it harder to think and plan. It makes our thinking brain go offline. The prefrontal cortex goes offline when we get anxious. So the worrying piece hasn't been shown to, be helpful for us. And in fact, has all sorts of health consequences where, anxiety is not good for us in the near or the long term. So, and I should say there are a bunch of memes on the internet that, there's some sweet spot of an inverted U-shaped curve around anxiety. That is not true. It's based on a 1908 study of Japanese dancing mice that people have it become folklore, this Yerkes-Dodson curve. No evidence showing that there is some optimal amount of anxiety. The research shows that it's inverse. So the more anxious you are, the worse you do.
Fascinating. So what the misconception is that a little bit of anxiety is actually good for performance? Is that accurately characterized?
Yeah. And if you look at the corollary, you look at the opposite of anxiety, what I see the most is when people are performing at their best, they're often describing it in terms of flow. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which is like selfless, effortless. You're completely merged with your experience to the point where there's no self there doing anything. It's just stuff happening. So if there's no one there, there's no one there to be anxious. So if you look at optimal performance, it's about the opposite of anxiety, where somebody is so expanded, they've merged with their environment. And if you look at anxiety, it's really a feeling of contraction and closed downness. So those two are pretty antithetical. Anxiety makes us feel closed and contracted. The more we let go or not get caught up in anxiety, the more expanded we feel. And the more we move into places like our growth zone, or the more we move into flow.
I was just going to say, yeah, so it's evoking what I know about flow. And it seems like anxiety is sort of like, very antithetical. So anxiety essentially at any dose is no bueno. But what's the difference then between anxiety and, for example, stress? Because we've talked a bit on this podcast, and I've written quite a bit about how small doses of stress can actually be beneficial, right? They can bring about our best self, whether it's from exercise, which is a form of stress, or sauna use, for example, even intermittent fasting to some degree.
Yeah. So I think you're highlighting one of the key elements, which is what type of stress are we talking about here? So psychological stress. So let's start with the difference between stress and anxiety. Stress tends to have a psychological stress tends to have a clear precipitant or something that's, driving it. Like, I look at my to-do list and it's too long. And so I get stressed out. And then when I check off my to-do list, because I've checked it off, the stress goes away. So with anxiety, it tends not to have a clear precipitant. Anxiety, the feeling of anxiety itself tends to trigger the mental behavior of worrying. So differences between stress and anxiety, there can be shared physical elements where they feel the same. It's like when I feel stressed, it feels similar to when I feel anxious. But what relieves the stress is when we do the things that make the stress go away. The more somebody has anxiety, the more they try to make it go away. The saying, what we resist persists. If they resist it, the more it sticks around and maybe it gets worse because they're like, oh no, I can't make it go away. So those are different in that respect, but I'm talking about psychological stress. And I think you're talking about some of these physiologic stressors that are truly adaptive. The fight, flight, freeze response is a physiologic thing. It's not a mental thing. And if you look at it even from a time scale, we react to danger much faster than we can think about it. And that's good, because if we had to wait to think, we would probably all be dead, because our thinking brain is pretty slow. The level of cognition and even emotion is a lot slower than reaction. So, you step out into a busy street, you see a car coming, you jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk before you're even conscious what happened. And then you start having these thoughts like, oh no, I could have gotten killed. And that's when that flood of adrenaline and whatnot comes through, and it says, whoa. And we could, at that moment, we could learn from it and be like, hey, you should put your phone away, or whatever was that caused us to not look as we stepped out into the street. So that could actually be adaptive as well in terms of a fear response. We learn from like, hey, that was dangerous, don't do that again. But if we sit there and we start mulling over it, we're like, oh, I can't believe I did that. I'm such a bad person. So here's where this bad stuff comes in. That's not adaptive. That just takes that energy and turns it toxic.
That makes a lot of sense. So what are then the most helpful ways of de-escalating stress and anxiety when it emerges?
Well, I'm a firm believer of understanding how our minds work. And I'm not saying that everybody has to get a PhD in neuroscience to do this. So then that's actually why I wrote my own Rethinking Anxiety book, was that they're actually pretty simple principles that we all can understand and learn pretty quickly. And once we know our minds work, we can work with them. And so I think of it as that, oh no, I almost died, can become an, oh, well, what can I learn from that? And so instead of reviewing and regretting, like, oh, I can't believe I did that, we can look and learn and be like, oh, well, I did that. What can I learn from this? And so, I think my research has shown that you can get a 3-step process, but I'm sure people can break this into other steps. But the basic process is, if you can't map your mind, if you can't see how your mind's working, you can't work with it. So that's where I start all my patients off, is to say, I'll meet at our first intake. I'll start mapping out these habit loops with them, whether it's worrying, whether it's negative thoughts, whether it's, stress eating, whatever it is. We'll map those out together. And sometimes just that is tremendously illuminating for people. I document some of these case studies in my book, where people, like, they come in 30 years of anxiety, and we take 30 seconds to map it out. And they're like, how did I not notice that before? Well, nobody taught you, or nobody, showed you that this is trigger behavior result. So anybody can map those processes out. In fact, we put together a habit mapper. I think we put it on the website, mapmyhabit.com. So anybody can download that for free. They can map out their own habits. That's the simplest place to start. And that's why we're trying to put some free resources out there so anybody can map out their habit loops. The second step, go ahead.
Well, I was going to bring up actually a personal experience that I had, where I had an interaction with I suppose he's a former friend at this point, but somebody who I thought I was close with. And he did something, acted in a way that left me with a very sour taste in my mouth. And I remember feeling very anxious about that experience. I was, for the next 48 hours afterwards, I was constantly reviewing and regretting both my response and then his response. And, the whole thing, it led to this anxiety loop that caused me to lose sleep, actually. the
Mhm.
night of the stimulus, the trigger event. And then, since then, every time I've thought about it, it causes me anxiety. So I'm trying to, think about what I could have perhaps done differently. In the moment, my tendency is to, because at this point, I've had experiences that have caused me anxiety, a handful of times, more than a handful of times over the course of my life. And one thing that I remind myself is that with time, everything heals
Mhm.
essentially. And so that's sort of my way of stepping outside of that repetitive feedback loop. But are there any other ways that I could have handled that situation?
Yeah, and the details, because everybody's got their own personal experiences of something of the flavor that you're talking about. So I'm guessing, most, if not everybody, can relate to what you're talking about. So here, what I would say is the details aren't as important as the process, and so it's like whatever happened, are we getting stuck in a ruminative habit loop? Like, oh, what could I have done differently? Versus, that's that review and regret versus the, oh, well, that didn't go well. What can I learn from that? And as we can get into the latter, we don't get stuck in these loops where, because if we get stuck in the review and regret, we get identified with that, like, oh, I did something wrong, or that person did something wrong, or whatever. And that doesn't let the healing process happen. If we look at it as like, well, that went a certain way that I wasn't expecting, oh, well, that helps us let go so that, like you're pointing out, when, if the thought comes up again, we don't kind of reinforce it and we don't reconsolidate the memory with the same emotional charge.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was brought it up with my therapist, and at the end of the day, I think it was a combination of time and insight.
Mm-hmm.
Really, it was the looking and learning aspect of things, and it required sort of getting another set of eyes on the situation as well, and realizing ultimately that it was instigated by this friend, and I think you have to realize that at the end of the day, hurt people. And so that's
Yeah.
sort of my way of contextualizing it, but super interesting, super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's, it's like we can't change the past. So, but we can certainly learn from it. So, I love this saying, and it may not be directly applicable here, but folks can look to see if it plays a role in their lives. It's like forgiveness is giving up hope of a better past.
Mm.
And so often we don't forgive ourselves, or we don't forgive the situation, or don't forgive the other person because we're hoping that something could have gone differently. But we can't change the past. So here we can look to see, am I holding on to this? Am I hoping for a better past? And can I let go of that and see that the past is the past? And can I learn from it? And, like you're pointing out, we can certainly develop insight, that's also one of my favorite phrases, hurt people. And so it's like, we can look at, have greater clarity where we have greater perspective as compared to zooming in on like, how am I, I don't want to say wronged, but how is this affecting me personally? How am I taking this personally? I'll put it that way. And we can let go of taking things personally and see things a little more with greater perspective, especially, like you're pointing out, hurt people. Well, there are circumstances that lead to them getting hurt. And so it's like often, hurt people, not necessarily because it's their fault. They've maybe had a traumatic childhood or something else. There can be lots of things that lead to that. And for me, it's helpful, to get that perspective, but then to even get the greater perspective is like, well, what led to the circumstances of that person being hurt, and then compassion arises where we can, see, oh, well, it's not their fault that they, were born into those circumstances or had, what X, Y, or Z happened to them. And then, for me, it kind of softens my heart toward the world as compared to going through the world seeing it as good and bad people.
Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. I mean, I think that is so important. Um, so yeah, I love this because, we can do our best to avoid um, anxiety producing stimuli as best we can, but inevitably life finds a way to throw you, to throw you off kilter, to throw some stress at you.
And actually, let me ask you a question about that. How much energy does it take to try to avoid stressful stimuli? And what would you, this is kind of I don't want to sound too pedantic here, but what if we took that energy and directed it toward learning how to respond to whatever happened?
Yeah, you're so right.
Of that?
Well, you're so right, because you're fighting a losing battle if you're trying to eliminate all stress from your life. I mean, I think that there are certainly ways that you can minimize your exposure to undue stress.
Sure.
But yeah, ultimately life is stressful. And so I think that your energy would be much better. You'd be much better served putting your energy to productive and helpful use by bolstering your resilience to it, and also how you react to those stimuli when they emerge.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like you're saying, it's stress is inevitable. And I think if you look at it at a very fundamental level, the only unchanging thing in the world is change itself, so we can't stop change, whatever that is, whether a body is age or the world changing or whatever, but we can change how we relate to that. And so if we are constantly reactive, then that's just going to cause more stress for us. But if we can learn to be responsive and relate to the change differently, then we can get used to that constant and not have it be stressful.
Is there a morning routine that is perhaps productive to better mental health, less anxiety, fewer negative thoughts over the course of the day?
Yeah, well, I would say some type of self-care, certainly as part of that. And I say that broadly because it looks different for everybody. So I'd like to say, everybody should sit down and meditate for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and do this type of meditation, and it will do this. Well, that's not how, everybody's individual. And so certainly broadly, anything that can help us kind of settle and be open and attuned to the day, and so that we can be more responsive than reactive, can be very helpful. For some people, that's exercise. For some people, that's meditation. For some people, that's yoga. For some people, that's prayer. So something that is self-supporting, I would say, is helpful. And I would also say, for me, and I've seen this, there's a whole realm of psychiatry that's now growing up around this called nutritional psychiatry. Certainly, what we put in our bodies makes a difference. And so what we, eating food that really supports our well-being is helpful. So, certainly junk food tends to not fall into the category of helpful. And, so I think people talk about clean food and, this and that, just checking to see what works best for us as compared to following some recipe where like, if I eat this, then I will feel better, because we can get stressed over, eating. There's even a condition called orthorexia where people focus too much on eating like healthy food, and it's unhealthy for them, ironically. So that's what I would say, some type of self-care, and that's very individual for folks.
Totally agree. How do we differentiate between garden variety anxiety, the anxiety that's to some degree an inevitable aspect of living in the 21st century, from clinical anxiety, like the kind of anxiety that would send somebody to see you as their physician?
That's a great question, because I think we all experience anxiety. So, and the garden variety probably feels very similar to the clinical anxiety. It's just a matter of how much it affects us. So you'll see these vague terms in the psychiatry textbooks around, in the diagnostic textbooks around, is it causing problems, basically? And so I don't think anybody would be like, well, anxiety is great for me, except for the folks that are too stuck on the inverted U-shaped curve thing. But, that aside, when it's debilitating, or when somebody wakes up in the morning and they feel anxious and they start worrying about how long they're going to be anxious, and they're anxious all day, and it causes them to not be able to function at work or with their family or socially. When it causes dysfunction, that tends to be when people land in my office, whether it's generalized anxiety, which is basically anxiety that lasts all day. That's pretty rough, or panic. I see a lot of folks with panic disorder. And interestingly, panic attacks do not equal panic disorder. You probably know this, but in case folks don't, I used to get panic attacks during residency. They're no fun.
Wow.
But because I was training to be a psychiatrist, I could learn that having a panic attack does not equal panic disorder. It's when we start to worry about having those future panic attacks and then avoiding situations where we might have a panic attack, all those things, that's what leads to debilitation, where, somebody can no longer drive on the highway and barely drive on local streets or something like that. That's when it falls into the disorder territory. And ironically, it's not the attack itself. It's that worry about the future.
Wow. Are we getting more anxious? I mean, how's business for you these days? Are you seeing more patients than you have in the past? Are we, from a societal standpoint, how are we looking?
Yeah, unfortunately, I wrote this unwinding anxiety book, and it became a New York Times bestseller, which I was never expecting. It's not like I'm a great writer or anything, but I think some of it was the circumstances where we saw so it was published first in 2021. And
it's a great book. People should definitely check it out. Yeah, we got a copy.
So that was somewhat circumstantial. We saw this huge spike of anxiety during the pandemic, and it was kind of this huge social experiment where there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty that had real danger associated with it, and uncertainty drives our minds bonkers. So, because with uncertainty, our brain's running around saying, "Oh no, oh no, oh no," and if we start worrying about the future, then suddenly that anxiety goes up, as compared to, oh, okay, I need to pay attention to this, but I don't need to freak out about it. Well, about 30% of the population or more, this was just like the clinical anxiety that was documented. It went up to like 30%, but I'm guessing it was much higher at the general level, where people were pretty anxious, but they were coping with it to some degree. So, unfortunately, the pandemic showed that, and I don't think it's really settled down much. So certainly, the pandemic anxiety has settled down as people start to learn more, and there's less unknown, and the variants tend to be, more attenuated. So they're less deadly, and vaccines and things like that. But if you look at everything else that's happening in the world, there's all this uncertainty around, war, and around food insecurity and environmental change. And so all of these things are stoking anxiety about the future as well, because we don't know what's going to happen, but there certainly seems to be a lot of change happening. And that's scary for us.
I think uncertainty is universally terrifying. I mean, probably for some more than for others. Like I personally don't handle uncertainty very well. Mm-hmm. It's, I'm terrible at booking trips, planning, et cetera, because I just it's so much more comfortable for me to stay within my little routine. Yeah. Are there ways to get more comfortable with uncertainty?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you bring this up, because this is very pragmatic. So one thing is just knowing that uncertainty causes us to be uncomfortable is helpful. So for example, uncertainty signals to our brain, hey, I need to check this situation out to see if there's danger here. Doesn't mean that there's danger. It just means that there's something different. So it's analogous to when our stomach's empty, it rumbles and it says, go get food. When our brain is quote unquote empty because we're not sure how we're outside of our routine, it says, go get information. Mm. And so just knowing that, like, oh, I'm feeling a little, uncertain, and notice how my brain wants me to go try to figure this out. So if we can figure it out, great. And so this is where, if we're planning a trip, for example, we're going someplace new, we can plan the trip and we can double check to make sure we haven't missed anything, maybe triple check, but we can start to see where we are falling into the habit of over planning, where we're starting to worry. And then it falls into this realm of, oh no, is this going to work out, as compared to, oh, I need to plan. So we can flip that oh no and say, oh, this is uncertainty. I've done everything that I can. And so now I've got to just leave the rest to it, and be able to adapt to whatever comes up. And so that saves our energy to be able to work in the moment with things that come up that are unexpected. And then we don't shut down and go, oh no, I got a flat tire on the way to the airport. Instead of like freaking out, which doesn't help that flat tire get changed, we can step back and go, oh, okay, not expected. Let's pull out the spare, or let's see what we can do. And what that does is, as we calm down, it helps our thinking brain come back online so we can plan. So it's change of plans. Can we adapt in those moments as compared to freaking out and going into our panic zone?
I love that. Super useful. I'm curious, are there people that are the difference that we see between individuals in one's tendency to how one reacts to uncertainty? Is it genetic? Is there like a I don't know, is it nature versus nurture? Or is it just, something that people that some get used to, whether it's like via their upbringing?
So the short answer is yes. So, certainly genes play a role in how we interpret the world, and our environment does, and how we grow up. It influences that as well, because we learn from, modeling. So whether it's our parents or our caregivers or our friends or our communities, they all model, people in those situations model behavior for us. So we can inherit a gene that makes us more predisposed to anxiety from a parent. And we can certainly learn from a parent as well, to be anxious. We don't have much control over our genes, at least right now, but we do have control over our minds in terms of how we learn. So if we've, no matter if we've won the genetic lottery or not, we can certainly learn how our minds work and learn to work with our minds in that respect. And that way we can work with our situations and work with our anxious minds. If we've learned to worry a lot, we can unlearn that.
How do we deal with, as a consequence of worry and anxiety? A lot of us often will go and head to the kitchen. And I know you have an app that helps people better avoid emotional eating, right?
Yeah.
But what are some tips that you can offer to avoid that? Because I feel like that's a big thing. I mean, I eat sometimes when I'm bored. A lot of people eat when they're anxious. What are some ways to put those kinds of habits under control?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here, mapping out whatever that habit loop is a good place to start. The second step there is really tapping into this reward-based learning system in our brains. And the way that works in a nutshell is that we're going to repeat behaviors that we've learned that are rewarding until proven otherwise. And what I mean by that is, if we don't pay attention and we don't see that they're no longer rewarding for us, then we're never going to change them. So this is where, we throw willpower out the window. And if you look at the mathematical formulae for habit change, it's about reward value. And so basically, without going into all the math, think of, chocolate cake or something like that. So let's say that you're bored. Let's say you like chocolate cake, and you go into the kitchen and you just eat some chocolate cake when you're bored. You don't pay attention to the consequences. I'll put myself in that scenario because I don't know if you like chocolate cake. But
love it. I love chocolate cake.
Okay, great.
Who doesn't like chocolate cake?
Page there. Yeah, I know.
Serial killers.
So if I eat chocolate cake when I'm bored, if I'm not hungry, I might get especially if I eat a bunch of it to kind of stuff down my emotions, I might not feel so good because my stomach's like, dude, why'd you eat that? I wasn't hungry. And then I also get that sugar rush and I crash and maybe I get a sour mood from it. And so all those negative consequences are, when I look at that, it's actually not that rewarding. the boredom itself isn't that big of a deal, but now I've made it a big deal because I've got a stomach ache and I'm moody and I've got, I'm sleepy and all that. So my lab actually did a study with our Eat Right Now app where we measured reward value in people who were overeating. And we specifically had them pay attention as they overate. What we found was that, are you ready for this? It only takes 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention when they overeat for that reward value to go below zero.
Wow.
Yeah. And what I mean, yeah, I know. So what I mean by that is we can shift these reward values pretty quickly. And all it takes is one ingredient, which is awareness. If we pay attention and we're stress eating and we see that it's not helpful for us, we get what are in neuroscientific term is called a negative prediction error. We had predicted that it would be at a certain reward value and it's lower than that. And when we get that prediction error, when there's a change from what is expected, we learn. Our dopamine fires in our brain and it says, hey, remember that. So if it's better than expected, we're like, wow, that was the best cake I've ever had. We remember that and we go eat that again. If it's a stomach ache and a sugar rush and crash from eating when we're bored and we pay attention, we learn from that as well. For example, for me, paying attention to the results of eating gummy worms.
Second time you brought up are gummy worms your vice?
They were. And now you can dangle them in front of my face. And I'm like, dude, why would I eat that?
Wow.
Because my brain is thoroughly disenchanted, right? It's like, I've had enough gummy worms to know that they're going to be anti-satisfying. But that also brings up the blueberries piece, which is, so when we become disenchanted with these old behaviors simply by paying attention, whether it's overeating or stress eating or junk food, our brain's going to look for something better. I call this the bigger, better offer. I detail that in the Unwinding Anxiety book. And the idea is give our brain something better. So I started comparing eating blueberries to gummy worms. To my brain, it was a no-brainer. Like blueberries have this perfect balance of sweetness. They probably co-evolved with our brains in that way to be that perfect sweetness. I'm sure lots of fruits did the same thing. So when I just think about, if you put gummy worms versus blueberries in front of me, my brain's going to go to blueberries every time because it's just it tastes better and it's so much more rewarding afterwards. And I don't have to eat the whole pint, because the gummy worms make me want to eat more. They get this craving for more. Whereas blueberries, I can actually enjoy them because I'm not like wanting.
That makes total sense. Blueberries. Yeah, blueberries definitely. I love them. They're so good when they have that perfect balance of sweet and tart to me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I was just eating some small plums earlier today. And when they are at that right balance between like sweet and tart, how did you put it?
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's certain fruits, like, especially when they're at the perfect, and sometimes like now I'm thinking of like when peaches are like perfectly ripe and they just melt in your mouth. That's also great. So there are lots of ways that these natural fruits have kind of evolved to like be those biggest, bestest offers.
Yeah. I love a tart fruit. I get pushback on social media sometimes because I prefer I love mango, and I like when mango is borderline unripe because it's got that tartness. Like if fruit is just pure sugar, I don't like it.
Yeah.
There's something about it that I just don't like. I don't like when it's mushy, but when that tartness, oh, so good.
Yeah. Yeah. And blueberries can be, when you get them right at that balance.
Yeah. Oh my God. So, I mean, one thing that I do, let me know if this is helpful or hurtful. I actually, because that sick feeling, sometimes when there's something that when I'm craving, but I know it's not the best for me, I actually will like eat like a lot of it so that I get my fill. I'm like full. I'm like so satisfied by the food, but that it makes me realize that this isn't the best food for me to eat on a daily basis. For example, we'll just say like pizza. Like I don't very frequently eat pizza, but once or twice a month, I'll do like a pizza day and I'll just let myself go all in, and I'll like kind of, I'll eat as much as I want because I don't like restricting myself. Yeah. When I've actually like consented and I've made an informed choice to go and have like a pizza night. And I like to eat so much that it actually that I almost feel a little bit sick, because then it reminds me why this is not the kind of thing that I want to, eat in smaller doses over the course of the, like my day to day.
Yeah.
Do I have an eating disorder? No.
No, it doesn't sound like it. You bring up a good point, which is, when we overindulge, and we can even overindulge on healthy food too, right? So it's that overindulgence piece. I think of it as the pleasure plateau. And so whether it's pizza, I actually was exploring this with somebody, so anybody that uses our apps, I run a live weekly group via Zoom that anybody can ask a question. It's like stump the professor type of thing. And so we work with people who are struggling, and somebody was struggling with eating New York style pizza. And for anybody that's had New York style pizza, it's pretty darn good.
Good.
Yeah. Like, especially when you find these little niche, like places in Brooklyn and whatever. And so, I said, okay, what was it like? They're like, oh, I just love eating pizza. I was like, okay, well, when you eat that first piece, what's it like? And they're like, oh, it's really good. When you just the second piece, what's it like? And they're like, oh, it's really good. And they actually started to hesitate, and they're like, well, yeah, it's good. And then I was like, what's the third piece like? And they're like, it's actually not that good. Same pizza. Right. So here, even with pizza, we don't have to necessarily go to excess to be like, oh, now I'm sick of this. We can, and I love the idea of not restricting ourselves, because, anytime we tell ourselves we can't have something, we're going to want it more. So that just doesn't work. And the whole self-restraint willpower thing, again, as we're talking about, not neuroscientifically valid. But if we ask ourselves, how much is enough? We can pay attention. And if the point is enjoying the food, if we pay attention, we're going to enjoy it more. And then we can ask ourselves, when have I met that? When have I hit that pleasure plateau where it's no longer pleasurable? And guess what? We could stop there. So, I would, your mission, should you choose to accept it, if you think this isn't bogus, is like, next time you go for pizza, be like, can I enjoy the pizza and not have the pizza coma afterwards by like stopping when I'm full? And see if you actually get any more pleasure from overindulging. I think of it as going off the cliff of overindulgence, right? What's that like versus stopping when you've actually had your fill? It might even be more satisfying to not have the pizza hangover, the pizza coma. I don't know. You can do the experiment and let me know.
I just think go big or go home. You know what I'm saying? Like,
well, I'm a big fan of that saying. And I'm just highlighting how certainly what you're describing can be helpful for some people. And we can also explore, can the going big be going big for ourselves in terms of how can we best take care of ourselves? And the overindulgence isn't necessarily a self-care aspect. It's just it's like we're going to beat our chest type of things of going big. And again, that can be fun. and it can also have negative consequences.
No, you're absolutely right. I think, I've found what works for me, and I derive like joy, like, I think it's like kind of from a meta standpoint, like it's like a funny way to approach these kinds of things. But I think, an ability to be moderate, I think, is definitely a skill worth developing.
Well, and with that, it's not like we've got to super train ourselves to do that. We just have to learn to pay attention more, right? That's the beauty of awareness. If you look at these behavior change formulae, it's about awareness. Everything is about awareness, because awareness is what helps calibrate the reward system.
And is meditation sort of one of those? Because I feel like meditation is often evoked, right? The practice of meditation is evoked often to help us become more aware and mindful.
Yeah. So certainly I've been meditating for a couple of decades, so I'm biased here. So,
wow.
Certainly meditation can be helpful, though what I've found is in our research studies, it's not. So it's a smaller circle within a larger circle of awareness. So meditation can help train us to pay attention, right? And within the larger circle, we can also pay attention without having to meditate. If we cultivates what I think of as our superpower, which is curiosity. So if we're truly curious, we're paying attention. We're really paying attention. So for example, let's go back to the pizza eating. If we're really curious, like, how many bites does it take for me to hit that pleasure plateau? We're not forcing ourselves to pay attention. We're not forcing ourselves to say, oh, I'm got to stop at 1 3/7/8, of a piece. It's like, oh, well, I like pizza. Let's pay attention and see where I'm getting to that pleasure plateau. We don't have to be some meditation master to be curious. Anybody can do that. And so here it's really about like, what do we all have that's available to all of us? What can we polish off? Like polish that we haven't been using very much. And often it's curiosity, and curiosity in itself is rewarding. If you look at, I help my patients who are trying to quit smoking or work with other addictions to develop their curiosity, because when they are having a cravings don't feel very good, and they can flip the valence to being curious. Like, instead of, oh no, I have this craving, I got to resist it, or I'm going to, let it take over me. We can go, oh, what does this craving feel like right now? And like you talk about, all things heal with time. Well, cravings go away if we stay with them, and we train people to write out their cravings. I even have people time them. I think the record that any of my patients has recorded is 13 minutes. They don't even last that long.
What is the, I guess the average, or what is the range? Like, how long does it take for some, like if you just like sit it out, like weather the storm of the craving?
It depends on how we sit it out. So if we are gritting our teeth and trying to force ourselves, and we're rigid, and that those winds of the craving are blowing against us, we can get blown over. And that can also make it feel like it's lasting a long time. If we soften to the experience and allow it to be there, it's like, supple, and we allow, it's like we can bend with it. Then sometimes these come and go within like 30 seconds. It really depends. And if here's the radical piece, is we can even lean into them, where we can say, oh, awesome, what can I learn from this? And then the obstacle becomes the way. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, but it's like, hey, craving, last as long as you want, as compared to, I'm going to be with this until it goes away, which often there's a subtle level of resistance there. So if we're like, oh, cool, craving, we can have a go big or go home moment. We can turn toward the craving and be like, hey, hang out, move in, do whatever you want. Like, let's, I'm going to relate to you differently. You can stick around as long as you want, because you can't get me, so to speak.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, people have cravings to food. Obviously, we've been talking about food, but also, I mean, my mind went to like ex-girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, like sometimes we feel cravings and then we want to act on that. We feel compelled to act on those cravings, whether it's like send a text message that we know we shouldn't be sending, or looking at somebody's social media profile that we know we shouldn't be looking at,
right,
etc.
Yeah. So here we can just turn toward it, let that obstacle become the way, and say, oh, what can I learn from this about myself? Like, what do cravings feel like? How long do they last? Where do I feel them in my body? And the more curious we get, the more we learn we can be with these unpleasant sensations. And we don't have to do anything to make them go away, and we don't have to act on them.
So we don't have to do anything. There's nothing that we should do. Like,
cravings come and go. The more we try to do something, the more likely they are to stick around. It's like we get their attention. They're like, oh, it's paying attention to me. They'll come back more.
Well, with meditation, I mean, you're taught like there is a way to respond to thoughts that arise, right? Like the action is to bring your thoughts back to or your attention back to whether it's your breath or your mantra, etc.
Well, that's a form of concentration meditation. There are also, and this can be done in conjunction with that, where we note whatever is arising. So if there's a thought, we just note it. Oh, there's a thought. If there's a sound, we just note that sound. If there's a body sensation, we note that. Oh, tightness, tension, burning. And so we acknowledge what's happening. We allow it to be there. And then we can also watch it come and go. So, we can bring our attention back to our breath, for example, if we're trying to develop an absorptive type of concentration. But as part of that, when something comes up, it's, if we try to ignore it or push it away, it's going to be hard to stay focused. And so here it's about really just allowing whatever to come up and acknowledge it, just, be aware of it. And then when it goes away, we can say, oh, that goes. And we've learned a critical component, which is that things come and go. There's impermanence. And that's good to know, especially when we're caught up in a craving and we're stuck in like, oh, this is going to last forever. If we're anxious, we're like, oh, this is going to last forever. We're resisting it. But if we acknowledge, oh, there's this feeling that's coming. Oh, what's going to come next? Oh, there's this thought. It's really unpleasant. Oh, well, let's see what thought comes next. And then, so we can start to see how ephemeral things are. And then certainly we can use an anchor like the breath or the body as a way to keep us anchored in the present moment. But that's not really, that's just to develop concentration. It doesn't help us see that things are impermanent, for example.
Wow. But I love it to just acknowledge it. Acknowledge the craving. Yeah. Hey, craving.
Yeah. Hey,
there
craving.
You are again, craving. Hope you're having a good day. See you later.
Notice how that's soft. We're allowing it to be there as compared to, hey, craving, I see you. You better not come close to me.
Yeah. Wow. So much good stuff. Okay. We've talked about diet. We've talked about, how to better deal with anxiety, set new habits, dissipate ephemeral cravings. Any other lifestyle tips? People talk a lot about the value of sleep when it comes to mental health, exercise and so forth. Any remaining sort of thoughts?
I'm sure everybody's heard all of those and they're all good. Eat healthy food, get enough sleep, exercise, but none of these I like how you talk about this in terms of lifestyle, like really approaching these things lightly, as a lifestyle as compared to a checklist of things that we have to do in order to be healthy. Ironically, if we approach them as a checklist, we'll get stressed out because we don't check them all. So they'll make us unhealthy. So yes, I would endorse probably everything that that you've already talked about with other people. But the thing here I would just really want to highlight is, curiosity and kindness. We haven't talked much about kindness, but curiosity can help us be with whatever's happening, and kindness can help us be with ourselves. And instead of getting caught up in self-judgmental habit loops, we can, be kind to ourselves, and we can start to see how that feels better than judging ourselves. So that's the only thing I would add from a mental perspective. And I would say both of these can serve us very, very well. And they can actually support all of these other lifestyle hopefully habits that we develop so that we can live happier, healthier lives.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Most people don't lack vision. There's a great Bible verse that everybody quotes all the time that says, where there's no vision, the people will perish. But I think if you dig deeper, most people have some vision. They know what they want to feel like, look like, where they'd like to go, what they'd like to live. They have dreams. Their issue is they think they're further from them than they are.